The ferry Calypso cut through the English Channel with the steady determination of a vessel that had made this crossing 1,000 times before, yet tonight the familiar journey carried an undercurrent of unease. Fog rolled across the water in great grey billows, transforming the midnight sailing into something altogether more mysterious than the routine passage from Dover to Calais that the ship's manifest proclaimed. In the first-class saloon, where polished brass fittings gleamed under the warm electric light and the Persian carpets muffled the sound of footsteps, an eclectic gathering of passengers had assembled for what each believed would be an unremarkable crossing. The atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke and the sort of brittle conversation that occurs when strangers of elevated social standing find themselves confined together in elegant surroundings. Lady Pemberton, resplendent in emerald silk that matched her famous necklace, sat with the rigid posture of one accustomed to being observed. Her fingers drummed nervously against her evening bag, a small betrayal of the anxiety she was otherwise concealing with admirable skill. Across the saloon, the theatrical impresario Marcus Whitfield paced with the restless energy of a caged leopard, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His dark eyes darted frequently toward the windows, where nothing but impenetrable fog pressed against the glass like ghostly fingers. Dr. Helena Voss, a distinguished woman whose prematurely silver hair spoke of a lifetime spent in scholarly pursuits, appeared absorbed in a medical journal, though her eyes had not moved across the page for several minutes. The young American heiress, Miss Dorothy Crane, normally the most vivacious member of any gathering, sat unusually quiet, nursing a brandy with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Near the bar, the ship's purser, Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, moved among the passengers with professional courtesy, but even his practiced smile seemed forced tonight. At a small table near the port windows, a compact gentleman with an egg-shaped head and an immaculately waxed moustache sat observing the scene with the quiet intensity of a naturalist studying exotic specimens. Hercule Poirot had boarded at Dover with the intention of enjoying a peaceful crossing to the continent, but his keen grey eyes had already noted the subtle signs of tension that permeated the saloon like an invisible miasma. The way Lady Pemberton's fingers never ceased their nervous drumming, the manner in which Mr. Whitfield's pacing followed a pattern that avoided certain areas of the room, the almost studied casualness with which Dr. Voss held her unread journal, all of these details registered in the little Belgian detective's methodical mind. The evening had proceeded with the sort of strained civility that characterizes gatherings of people who know more about each other than they care to admit, when at precisely 11:47 a sound pierced through the fog-muffled quiet of the ferry. It was not quite a scream, not quite a cry, but something between the two, a sound of absolute terror that seemed to freeze the very air in the saloon. The sound had come from the direction of the private stateroom reserved for the evening's most distinguished passenger, the renowned art collector, Sir Reginald Blackwood. For a moment, the saloon remained suspended in that peculiar silence that follows an unexpected and disturbing noise, as if everyone were holding their breath and hoping they had imagined what they had heard. It was Poirot who moved first, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to taking charge of situations that others found paralyzing. His patent leather shoes made no sound on the Persian carpet as he crossed the saloon, but his movement seemed to break the spell that had frozen the other passengers. Captain Morrison appeared from the direction of the bridge, his weathered face grim with concern, a master key gleaming in his hand. The captain's key turned in the lock of Sir Reginald's stateroom with a sharp click that echoed through the narrow corridor like a gunshot. What lay beyond that door would transform a routine midnight crossing into something far more sinister, and would call upon all of Hercule Poirot's considerable powers of deduction to unravel. Sir Reginald Blackwood lay sprawled across his writing desk, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his lifeless fingers still clutching a fountain pen that had traced its final, incomplete word across expensive notepaper. Blood had pooled beneath his head, staining the Persian rug that covered the stateroom floor, and scattered across the cabin were the contents of his private attaché case. Documents, photographs, and several letters tied with black ribbon that suggested secrets far more valuable than any artwork in his collection. But it was not merely the presence of death that made Captain Morrison's blood run cold as he surveyed the scene. The stateroom's porthole stood open, allowing the fog to drift inside like seeking fingers, and on the small table beside the berth lay an ornate letter opener, its silver blade gleaming with dark stains that told their own story. Hercule Poirot stepped carefully into the stateroom, his eyes taking in every detail with the methodical precision that had made his reputation. The position of the body, the scattered papers, the convenient placement of the weapon, all of it spoke to his experienced mind of a crime that was both brutal and carefully planned. "Mon Dieu," he murmured softly, his accent lending gravity to the words. "We have here not merely a tragedy, but a puzzle most complex." He turned to Captain Morrison, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Captain, I fear your midnight ferry has become something rather more significant. A sealed chamber containing a murderer who has nowhere to run and nowhere to hide." As the fog continued to swirl outside the porthole and the ferry's engines maintained their steady rhythm toward the French coast, Hercule Poirot began the mental process that had solved so many mysteries before. Somewhere among the passengers in the first-class saloon lurked a killer, and it would require all of his famous little grey cells to unmask the truth before the Calypso reached port, and the murderer disappeared forever into the dawn. The announcement of Sir Reginald Blackwood's death fell upon the first-class saloon like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and apprehension through the assembled passengers. Captain Morrison's weathered face bore the grim expression of a man who had witnessed many tragedies at sea. Yet the deliberate nature of this death clearly weighed heavily upon him as he surveyed the elegant gathering that had so suddenly transformed from a collection of distinguished travelers into a circle of potential suspects. The fog continued to press against the windows with ghostly persistence, as if the very elements conspired to trap them all within this floating chamber of secrets, while the steady thrumming of the ferry's engines provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the mounting tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Lady Pemberton's reaction was perhaps the most studied of all, her aristocratic composure holding firm even as her face drained of color and her fingers sought the familiar comfort of her emerald necklace. Yet Hercule Poirot, observing from his position near the hearth, noted with professional interest how her relief seemed almost as pronounced as her shock, as if the news had resolved some terrible uncertainty rather than created it. Her eyes darted briefly toward Marcus Whitfield before settling on a point somewhere beyond the captain's shoulder, and when she spoke, her voice carried the practiced modulation of one accustomed to controlling both her words and her emotions. "How perfectly dreadful," she murmured, though the tremor in her hands as she reached for her evening bag suggested depths of feeling that her carefully chosen words did not reveal. Marcus Whitfield's theatrical instincts seemed to desert him entirely in the face of genuine crisis, his usual commanding presence replaced by a peculiar rigidity that made him appear almost fragile despite his imposing stature. The restless energy that had characterized his earlier pacing had crystallized into an unnatural stillness, yet his dark eyes continued their nervous reconnaissance of the saloon with even greater intensity than before, as if seeking escape routes that did not exist or measuring distances that could not be bridged. When Captain Morrison's gaze fell upon him, Whitfield cleared his throat with deliberate precision and straightened his already perfect posture, but the gesture only served to emphasize the tension coiled within his frame like a spring wound too tightly. Dr. Helena Voss closed her medical journal with a sharp snap that echoed through the suddenly silent saloon, the sound somehow more final than any spoken word. Her scholarly detachment seemed to deepen rather than crack under the pressure of the moment, as if she were mentally cataloguing the reactions around her with the same clinical precision she might apply to symptoms in a patient. Yet Poirot observed the slight tremor that ran through her usually steady hands as she adjusted her spectacles, and the way her grey eyes lingered on each face in turn, not with the casual interest of a fellow passenger, but with the focused attention of someone seeking specific information or confirmation of particular suspicions. Miss Dorothy Crane's youth made her shock appear more genuine and less controlled than that of her fellow passengers, her brandy glass trembling in her hands as she set it down with excessive care, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter more than crystal. The tears that gathered in her eyes seemed real enough, yet Poirot noted how she glanced repeatedly toward the writing desk, where she had claimed to be composing a letter to her father, and how her gaze lingered on the sealed envelope that lay beside her untouched correspondence, its contents as mysterious as the motives that swirled through the fog-shrouded saloon. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell abandoned his practiced smile entirely, his professional mask slipping to reveal the genuine concern of a man who understood that his ship had become something far more dangerous than a simple passenger vessel. His hands trembled as he attempted to busy himself with unnecessary tasks behind the bar, polishing glasses that already gleamed and arranging bottles that required no adjustment. Yet his eyes never ceased their careful monitoring of the passengers' movements and expressions, as if he were mentally cataloguing each reaction for future reference, or perhaps seeking reassurance that his own secrets remained safely hidden. It was then that Poirot chose to step forward, his compact figure radiating an authority that seemed disproportionate to his modest stature. "Captain Morrison," he said, his accented English carrying the quiet confidence that had earned him respect from Scotland Yard to the Sûreté, "I am Hercule Poirot, and I believe I may be of some assistance in this matter. Until the proper authorities can be summoned, perhaps it would be wise to ensure that the scene of the crime remains undisturbed and that all persons who might have information relevant to this tragedy remain available for questioning." The captain's relief was visible as he readily accepted the famous detective's offer of assistance, recognizing that the presence of such a renowned investigator might be the difference between justice and chaos in the confined world of the Ferry. Poirot's keen grey eyes swept the assembled passengers with the methodical precision of a naturalist studying specimens, noting not only their obvious reactions, but also the subtle currents of emotion that flowed beneath the surface of their shocked expressions. The way Lady Pemberton avoided direct eye contact with Whitfield while simultaneously seeming hyper-aware of his every movement, the clinical detachment with which Dr. Voss observed Miss Crane's distress, the careful distance that Hartwell maintained from the other passengers, while somehow remaining acutely conscious of their every gesture, all suggested relationships far more complex than those of strangers thrown together by circumstance. The fog outside seemed to thicken with each passing moment, transforming the ferry into an isolated world where normal rules no longer applied, and where a murderer walked among them with the same freedom as the innocent. Poirot felt the familiar stirring of his little grey cells as they began their methodical work of sorting and analyzing the human drama unfolding before him, knowing that somewhere in the tangle of shocked reactions and carefully controlled emotions lay the key to understanding not only who had killed Sir Reginald Blackwood, but why the deed had been deemed necessary on this particular night, in this particular place, among this particular gathering of people who were proving to be far less strangers to one another than they had initially appeared. The atmosphere in the first-class saloon had transformed completely in the wake of Captain Morrison's grim announcement, the elegant gathering of distinguished passengers now resembling nothing so much as a collection of exotic birds trapped in an ornate cage, each acutely aware that among them perched a predator whose true nature remained carefully concealed. Hercule Poirot surveyed this tableau with the quiet satisfaction of a master craftsman presented with materials perfectly suited to his particular expertise, his grey eyes taking in not merely the obvious signs of shock and distress, but the subtle currents of emotion that flowed beneath the surface like dangerous undercurrents in seemingly calm waters. The fog continued to press against the windows with ghostly persistence, transforming the ferry into an isolated world where normal social conventions had been suspended and replaced by the far more primitive dynamics of suspicion and self-preservation. Captain Morrison, his weathered face bearing the unmistakable relief of a man who had found an expert to shoulder an impossible burden, readily accepted Poirot's quiet assumption of authority over the investigation. "The crime scene must be preserved with absolute precision," Poirot instructed, his accented English carrying the weight of unquestionable expertise. "And no one must be permitted to leave this saloon until I have had the opportunity to speak with each person individually. This vessel has become, for the moment, a sealed chamber, and within it walks a murderer who believes themselves safe from discovery." The captain's immediate compliance with these directives sent a clear message to the assembled passengers that they were no longer merely travelers, but potential suspects in a case that would require all of Poirot's considerable powers to unravel. The detective's first priority was a thorough examination of Sir Reginald's stateroom, and as he stepped carefully through the doorway, his trained eye immediately began cataloguing the details that would either support or contradict the obvious interpretation of events. The scene appeared to tell a straightforward story of interrupted burglary, with the victim's attaché case gaping open and its contents scattered across the Persian rug. Yet Poirot's experience had taught him to distrust scenarios that presented themselves too conveniently. The fountain pen, still gripped in the dead man's fingers, had traced an incomplete word across expensive notepaper, the letters "Mar" ending in a telling blot that might have pointed suspicion toward Marcus Whitfield, yet the detective noted how the pen's nib was bent at an angle, suggesting it had been struck, rather than simply dropped by failing strength. More intriguing still was the evidence that spoke to careful staging rather than genuine chaos, particularly the ornate letter opener that lay positioned with theatrical precision beside the victim's outstretched hand, its silver blade bearing dark stains that proclaimed its role in the tragedy. Yet the open porthole, which should have been damp with condensation if it had remained open throughout the foggy evening, showed moisture only on its upper surfaces, suggesting it had been opened recently and deliberately. On the carpet near the desk chair, Poirot discovered a single thread of pale green silk, so fine it might easily have been overlooked, yet its presence there suggested contact between the victim and someone wearing evening attire of that particular shade. The detective's methodical examination revealed additional inconsistencies that troubled his orderly mind, including the presence of two distinct types of ash in the room's crystal ashtray, one from Sir Reginald's preferred small cigars, and another from pipe tobacco that suggested a second person had been present for a considerable time before the murder occurred. The victim's personal correspondence, tied with black ribbon and bearing the impressed seals of what appeared to be official documents, had been hastily retied after examination, leaving telltale traces of sealing wax on the inside of the attaché case that spoke to hurried searching rather than random vandalism. When Poirot returned to the saloon, he found the passengers arranged in attitudes that revealed far more about their inner states than their carefully controlled expressions might have suggested. Lady Pemberton sat with rigid composure, yet her fingers betrayed her nervousness through their constant adjustment of her emerald necklace, and the detective noted how one clasp showed a jagged thread of bright silk that matched neither her evening gown nor the green thread he had discovered in the stateroom. Marcus Whitfield had abandoned his restless pacing for a chair near the windows, yet his overcoat cuff bore traces of dampness that suggested recent exposure to the fog-laden air, despite Captain Morrison's strict orders that all outer doors had been sealed before the crime occurred. Dr. Helena Voss maintained her scholarly composure with admirable control. Yet Poirot observed how her medical journal remained open to the same page it had displayed earlier, the print dry where a reader's finger should have left moisture, while along the margin appeared a faint smear of pink sealing wax that suggested she had handled recently sealed documents. Miss Dorothy Crane presented a picture of youthful distress that seemed genuine enough, Yet her writing materials were arranged with suspicious tidiness, and the envelope beside her correspondence bore a French stamp, despite her claim to be writing to her father in New York. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell had recovered his professional demeanor, yet his knowledge of the ship's layout and his access to master keys provided opportunities that the other passengers lacked, while his nervous energy manifested itself in unnecessary polishing of already gleaming glassware. When Poirot began his preliminary questioning, each passenger's responses revealed carefully prepared explanations that nonetheless contained small but significant contradictions, the sort of minor inconsistencies that betrayed the difference between lived experience and constructed narrative. The detective listened to their accounts with the patience of a physician diagnosing a complex ailment, noting not only what they chose to reveal, but what they unconsciously betrayed through gesture, tone, and the telling pauses that punctuated their carefully rehearsed explanations. Lady Pemberton's claim of casual acquaintance with the victim seemed undermined by her intimate knowledge of his collecting interests, while Whitfield's theatrical background had clearly trained him in controlled expression. Yet his current emotional state suggested feelings too powerful to be entirely contained by professional skill. As the interviews progressed, Poirot began to perceive the intricate web of relationships that connected these seemingly disparate individuals, each carrying secrets that went far deeper than their polite social facade suggested. The fog outside seemed to mirror the obscurity that surrounded their true motivations, while the confined space of the ferry created an atmosphere where every glance and gesture took on heightened significance. Somewhere in this tangle of hidden motives and carefully constructed alibis lay the key to understanding why Sir Reginald Blackwood had died on this particular night, surrounded by people who claimed to barely know him yet whose lives had somehow become fatally intertwined with his own. And Hercule Poirot felt the familiar stirring of his little grey cells as they began their methodical work of separating truth from deception in the complex psychological puzzle that lay before him. The interviews commenced in the ship's small reading alcove, where Hercule Poirot had arranged 2 chairs with characteristic precision, positioning himself to observe not merely words but the subtle betrayals of gesture and expression that so often revealed more than intended confessions. The electric lamps cast a warm glow that softened harsh lines without diminishing the detective's ability to perceive truth, while beyond the windows the fog pressed against the glass like curious spirits seeking entry to witness the unfolding drama. Each suspect would face the same courteous yet penetrating examination, their carefully constructed facades subjected to the methodical scrutiny that had made Poirot's reputation throughout Europe. Lady Pemberton entered first, her emerald silk gown rustling with aristocratic authority. Yet Poirot observed how her fingers betrayed her inner turmoil through their constant adjustment of the magnificent necklace that adorned her throat. Her account of the evening began with practiced composure, describing a routine journey to visit friends in Paris, yet when questioned about her relationship with Sir Reginald, subtle cracks appeared in her carefully maintained veneer. "We were acquainted through mutual interests in fine art," she explained, though her intimate knowledge of his recent acquisitions suggested familiarity far beyond casual social contact. The detective noted how she avoided mentioning financial matters until pressed, whereupon she reluctantly admitted to recent difficulties that had necessitated the discreet sale of several family heirlooms, creating circumstances that might drive even a lady of breeding to desperate measures. When Poirot mentioned the pale green silk thread discovered in the victim's stateroom, Lady Pemberton's reaction was swift and telling, her hand instinctively moving to a small tear in her evening shawl that she had clearly hoped would pass unnoticed. Her explanation of spending the crucial hour in the lady's retiring room seemed plausible, until the detective gently noted that the steward had observed her walking the fog-shrouded deck despite her expensive attire, a contradiction that brought a flush of color to her carefully powdered cheeks and a momentary loss of the composure that was clearly her most valued armor against the world's suspicions. Marcus Whitfield approached the interview with theatrical confidence that gradually dissolved under Poirot's patient questioning, his dramatic gestures becoming increasingly forced as inconsistencies emerged in his carefully rehearsed narrative. The impresario claimed to have spent the evening pacing the saloon in nervous anticipation of reaching Paris, yet the dampness on his overcoat cuff told a different story, suggesting recent exposure to the heavy fog that blanketed the ferry's exterior passages. When confronted with physical evidence, Whitfield's explanation of stepping briefly onto the promenade for air seemed reasonable until Poirot observed that such areas had been sealed by the captain's orders, making his presence there possible only with assistance from someone possessing master keys. The incomplete word "ma" that Sir Reginald had apparently attempted to write before his death created visible distress in the theatrical producer, his immediate assumption that this pointed to his own guilt, revealing knowledge of circumstances he had not yet disclosed. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Whitfield eventually admitted to financial entanglements with the victim that went far beyond simple patronage, involving loans and guarantees that had created a web of obligation and potential blackmail that might drive a desperate man to violence when other solutions proved inadequate. Dr. Helena Voss presented an entirely different challenge. Her scholarly demeanor and medical training providing both the knowledge to commit efficient murder and the analytical skills to construct a nearly perfect alibi. Her clinical detachment seemed almost inappropriate given the tragic circumstances, yet her explanation of studying medical journals throughout the evening appeared credible until Poirot noted the pink sealing wax that stained her supposedly unread pages, evidence of contact with Sir Reginald's private correspondence that contradicted her claims of distant acquaintance. Her admission of treating the victim's cardiac condition months earlier established both medical knowledge and previous contact, while her presence on the upper deck during the thickest fog created opportunities that her scholarly facade was designed to conceal. Miss Dorothy Crane's youth and apparent vulnerability created their own form of camouflage, her tearful distress and trembling hands presenting innocence that might easily deceive a less experienced investigator. Yet Poirot's trained eye noted the French stamp on the envelope beside her correspondence, directly contradicting her claim of writing to her father in New York, while the suspicious neatness of her writing materials suggested careful staging rather than interrupted composition. When gently questioned about this geographical inconsistency, her flustered explanation revealed connections to Paris that she had clearly hoped to keep hidden, creating motives and opportunities that her youthful appearance was designed to deflect. Geoffrey Hartwell's position as ship's purser provided unique advantages, his master keys and intimate knowledge of the vessel's layout making movements possible that would have been impossible for ordinary passengers. His professional demeanor remained intact throughout questioning, yet Poirot detected nervous energy that manifested in excessive attention to uniform details and protocol explanations that seemed designed to avoid more dangerous topics. The purser's confirmation that all portholes had been secured early in the voyage seemed to eliminate certain possibilities until the detective recalled the dampness on only the upper surfaces of Sir Reginald's cabin porthole, suggesting it had been opened after the general securing of the ship, a detail that only someone with appropriate access could have accomplished. As each interview concluded, Poirot found himself confronting a web of interconnected relationships and hidden motives that defied simple explanation, every suspect possessing means and opportunity while presenting alibis containing just enough truth to seem plausible yet sufficient deception to arouse suspicion. The fog outside continued its relentless assault on the windows, transforming the ferry into an isolated world where normal rules seemed suspended, while somewhere among these carefully constructed lies lay the key to understanding which troubled soul had chosen murder as their solution to desperation. The evidence against Marcus Whitfield crystallized with the sort of devastating clarity that brings relief to troubled minds seeking simple solutions to complex problems. and Captain Morrison found himself embracing this apparent resolution with the gratitude of a man who had witnessed enough maritime tragedies to appreciate the comfort of obvious answers. The incomplete word "ma" that Sir Reginald had seemingly struggled to write with his dying breath pointed directly toward the theatrical impresario, while the financial documents discovered in Whitfield's cabin painted a picture of desperate indebtedness that provided compelling motive for murder. Letters from creditors, demands for immediate repayment, and contracts bearing Sir Reginald's signature as guarantor created a web of obligation that might drive even a successful man to violence when faced with professional and personal ruin. The physical evidence seemed equally damning, particularly the dampness on Whitfield's overcoat cuff that contradicted his claims of remaining safely within the saloon throughout the crucial period, since Captain Morrison had personally supervised the sealing of all external passages shortly after departure from Dover. When confronted with this inconsistency, Whitfield's explanation shifted uncomfortably from innocent need for fresh air to reluctant admission of a clandestine meeting with Sir Reginald on the fog-shrouded promenade, where they had supposedly discussed the renegotiation of his crushing financial obligations. His theatrical training, which normally served him well in maintaining composure under pressure, seemed to desert him entirely as the evidence accumulated, his carefully constructed facade cracking to reveal the desperation that had apparently driven him to commit the ultimate crime. Captain Morrison's announcement that Whitfield would be placed under formal arrest pending arrival in Calais sent a wave of palpable relief through the first-class saloon, the other passengers exhaling collectively a suspicion focused with laser intensity upon the increasingly frantic impresario. Lady Pemberton's fingers finally ceased their nervous adjustment of her emerald necklace, her aristocratic composure returning as the threat of scrutiny shifted away from her own secrets, while Dr. Voss closed her medical journal with an air of clinical satisfaction that suggested professional approval of the captain's logical deduction. Miss Dorothy Crane's tearful distress seemed to ease slightly, though her youth and apparent vulnerability continued to evoke sympathy from those who preferred to see innocence rather than complicity in her trembling hands and wide eyes. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional demeanor strengthened noticeably as the investigation appeared to reach its conclusion, his nervous energy transforming into efficient assistance with the captain's arrangements for securing the prisoner. Yet his relief seemed almost too pronounced for a man whose only concern should have been the smooth operation of his vessel. The purser's intimate knowledge of the ship's layout and his possession of master keys had provided opportunities that other passengers lacked. Yet with Whitfield's apparent guilt established, such considerations seemed unnecessary complications to minds seeking closure rather than continued investigation. Yet Hercule Poirot observed this apparently satisfying resolution with the skeptical eye of a craftsman who recognized shoddy workmanship when confronted with it, his methodical mind troubled by inconsistencies that others seemed eager to overlook in their haste to identify a convenient culprit. The detective's careful examination of the crime scene had revealed details that supported Whitfield's guilt only if one ignored equally significant evidence pointing in entirely different directions, and his extensive experience had taught him that murderers rarely provided such obvious clues unless they possessed skills far superior to those displayed by the increasingly desperate producer. The positioning of the ornate letter opener beside Sir Reginald's body struck Poirot as particularly suspicious, its theatrical placement suggesting someone with knowledge of how such scenes should appear rather than the chaotic aftermath of genuine struggle, while the victim's fountain pen had been struck rather than simply dropped, creating the distinctive blot that obscured whatever word he had actually attempted to write. Most troubling of all was the presence of pipe tobacco ash in Sir Reginald's ashtray, despite Whitfield's exclusive preference for cigarettes, a detail that suggested another visitor whose presence had been carefully concealed from the obvious narrative of guilt and retribution. The timing of events required Whitfield to have committed murder, staged the elaborate scene, and returned to the saloon within a window so narrow that even theatrical training could hardly have made such efficiency possible, while the porthole that had supposedly been opened to dispose of evidence showed moisture patterns consistent with recent manipulation by someone possessing both access and intimate knowledge of the ship's security procedures. When Poirot mentioned these temporal and physical inconsistencies, Captain Morrison's relief transformed into visible frustration, his desire for simple resolution conflicting with the detective's insistence upon methodical accuracy that refused to ignore inconvenient facts in favor of convenient conclusions. The other passengers displayed similar impatience with complications that threatened to prolong their confinement aboard the fog-bound ferry, their eagerness to accept Whitfield's guilt revealing more about their own hidden anxieties than their confidence in the evidence presented. Lady Pemberton's vocal support for the obvious solution seemed particularly suspicious, given her earlier nervousness and the pale green silk thread that connected her to the crime scene, while Dr. Voss's clinical analysis of the case against Whitfield displayed the sort of professional detachment that might effectively mask personal involvement in events she claimed to have observed from a scholarly distance. As the ferry approached the French coast and the fog began its gradual retreat toward the horizon, Poirot found himself confronting a case that appeared solved on its surface, yet concealed depths of deception that challenged even his considerable powers of analysis. The obvious solution satisfied everyone's desperate desire for closure and escape from the floating chamber of suspicion that the elegant vessel had become, yet the detective's methodical mind rejected conclusions that ignored inconvenient evidence in favor of narratives that provided comfort rather than truth. Somewhere in the tangle of hidden relationships and carefully constructed alibis lay the real explanation for Sir Reginald's death, and Hercule Poirot remained determined to uncover it, regardless of how fervently the other passengers wished to accept the comfortable fiction of Whitfield's convenient guilt, knowing that his little grey cells would accept nothing less than complete understanding of the psychological puzzle that lay before him. The apparent resolution of the case had settled over the first-class saloon like a comfortable blanket, yet Hercule Poirot found himself increasingly disturbed by the eagerness with which his fellow passengers embraced conclusions that satisfied convenience rather than truth. While Captain Morrison busied himself with arrangements for Marcus Whitfield's transfer to French authorities, the detective observed the subtle transformations in behavior that accompanied the lifting of general suspicion, noting how relief manifested differently in each individual according to their particular anxieties and hidden guilts. The fog had begun its gradual retreat, allowing pale moonlight to filter through the windows and cast shifting patterns that seemed to mirror the psychological currents flowing beneath the surface of apparent tranquility. Yet Poirot sensed that the most dangerous currents remained carefully concealed. Rather than accept the comfortable fiction of Whitfield's obvious guilt, Poirot decided to conduct what he privately termed a small experiment in human nature, arranging the saloon's furniture with characteristic precision to create an intimate theater where truth might emerge through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. He requested that Captain Morrison permit a brief gathering before the formal transfer of the prisoner, ostensibly to clarify certain procedural matters. Yet his true purpose was to observe how each suspect would react when confronted with evidence that challenged their carefully constructed narratives. The detective positioned himself strategically near the windows, where the retreating fog provided dramatic backdrop for the psychological drama he was about to orchestrate. Lady Pemberton entered this reconvened gathering with renewed aristocratic composure, her earlier nervousness apparently dissolved by the comforting certainty of Whitfield's guilt, yet Poirot noted how her fingers continued their unconscious adjustment of the emerald necklace despite her outward calm. When the detective began discussing the curious positioning of evidence in Sir Reginald's stateroom, mentioning with apparent casualness the pale green silk thread discovered near the victim's desk, her immediate glance toward her damaged evening shawl provided confirmation that she recognized the significance of this physical evidence. Her quick explanation of the garment's condition seemed too readily prepared for genuine spontaneity, While her suggestion that such threads might be found anywhere on a vessel carrying passengers in evening attire demonstrated the sort of defensive thinking that characterized those with substantial secrets to protect. Dr. Helena Voss presented a different challenge entirely, her scholarly demeanor and medical training providing natural armor against psychological pressure, yet Poirot detected subtle signs of strain beneath her clinical composure when he began questioning the medical aspects of the crime. His casual mention of the victim's apparent cardiac condition drew from her professional knowledge that seemed suspiciously detailed for someone claiming minimal acquaintance with Sir Reginald, while her theoretical discussion of various methods for inducing heart failure revealed expertise that went far beyond casual medical interest. When Poirot produced the small sample of pink sealing wax that had been discovered on her supposedly unread journal pages, her momentary pause in scholarly discourse suggested recognition of evidence she had hoped would remain unnoticed. Miss Dorothy Crane's youthful vulnerability continued to provide effective camouflage for reactions that might have seemed suspicious in someone of greater experience. Yet Poirot's trained eye perceived calculation beneath her, tearful distress when he began discussing the geographical inconsistencies in her correspondence. Her apparent relief at Whitfield's arrest seemed genuine enough, yet when the detective mentioned the French stamp on her letter, supposedly addressed to New York, her explanation shifted with telling rapidity from innocent mistake to reluctant admission of connections to Paris that she had clearly hoped to keep hidden. The suspicious neatness of her writing materials became even more pronounced when contrasted with her claims of emotional disturbance, suggesting preparation rather than genuine disruption of innocent activities. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional efficiency in assisting with the evening's arrangements provided convenient distraction from his own nervous energy, yet Poirot observed how the purser's relief seemed disproportionate to his official responsibilities when he began questioning the ship's security procedures. The detective's inquiries about the sealing of portholes and external passages revealed Hartwell's intimate knowledge of timing and access that created opportunities others lacked, while his explanation of routine inspections failed to account for the specific moisture patterns discovered in Sir Reginald's cabin. When Poirot casually demonstrated the peculiar mechanism required to operate the stateroom's porthole, noting how it demanded specific knowledge of the ship's fittings, Hartwell's unconscious correction of the detective's technique betrayed familiarity that contradicted his claims of limited access to passenger accommodations. As the psychological pressure mounted through seemingly innocent conversation and demonstration, each suspect began displaying reactions that revealed the inadequacy of their carefully constructed alibis when subjected to methodical scrutiny. Lady Pemberton's attempts to redirect attention toward Whitfield's obvious financial motives betrayed knowledge of the victim's business affairs that contradicted her claims of social distance, while her nervous energy manifested in increasingly elaborate adjustments to her jewelry that suggested deep-seated anxiety rather than aristocratic composure. Dr. Voss's clinical detachment showed cracks when Poirot mentioned the specific timing required for the crime, her medical knowledge providing insights into methods and opportunities that she had clearly hoped would remain unexamined. The detective's masterful orchestration of this psychological theater reached its crescendo when he produced the ornate letter opener from Sir Reginald's stateroom, ostensibly to demonstrate how its weight and balance would affect the trajectory of blood spatter, yet actually observing how each suspect reacted to the weapon's presence. Hartwell's instinctive familiarity with its handling, Dr. Voss's clinical assessment of its efficiency as a murder weapon, Lady Pemberton's visible recoil from its stained blade, and Miss Crane's fascinated horror all provided additional pieces to the complex puzzle that was slowly revealing its true pattern under Poirot's methodical pressure. As the ferry approached the lights of Calais and the fog continued its retreat toward the horizon, Poirot felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing his little grey cells begin to arrange the scattered elements of truth into their proper configuration. The obvious solution of Whitfield's guilt had served its purpose in lowering the defenses of the real culprit, Yet now, the detective sensed that the psychological pressure he had so carefully applied was beginning to crack the facade of innocence that concealed the true murderer. Somewhere in the tangle of nervous reactions and unconscious betrayals he had just witnessed lay the key to understanding not only who had killed Sir Reginald Blackwood, but why the deed had been deemed necessary on this particular night, among this particular gathering of people whose lives had become fatally intertwined in ways that went far deeper than any of them had initially revealed. The lights of Calais harbour pierced through the dissipating fog like golden needles threading through grey silk, their warm glow promising an end to the claustrophobic tension that had gripped the ferry throughout the long night. Yet Hercule Poirot observed the approaching French coast with none of the relief that animated his fellow passengers. The apparent resolution of Marcus Whitfield's guilt had settled over the first-class saloon like a comfortable blanket. Yet the detective's methodical mind remained troubled by inconsistencies that refused to align themselves with the convenient narrative of financial desperation and theatrical violence that everyone seemed so eager to embrace. Captain Morrison busied himself with preparations for the formal transfer of the prisoner to French authorities, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a man who believed his vessel's reputation had been preserved despite the tragic circumstances, while the other passengers began gathering their belongings with the anticipations of those who had survived an ordeal and lived to tell the tale. It was precisely at this moment of apparent resolution that the ship's wireless operator burst into the saloon, his young face pale with excitement and his hands trembling as he clutched a telegram that would shatter every assumption they had carefully constructed throughout the evening's investigation. Captain Morrison snatched the message with the impatience of a man eager to complete his official duties, yet as his eyes scanned the terse lines of official communication, his expression transformed from satisfaction to bewilderment, then to something approaching horror as the implications of the message became clear. "Gentlemen, ladies," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of revelation that would change everything they thought they understood. "I have received word from the Dover authorities that fundamentally alters our situation. The man we knew as Sir Reginald Blackwood was not Sir Reginald Blackwood at all, but rather one Edmund Hartley, a known associate of art forgers who had been using the real Sir Reginald's identity for purposes we can only speculate upon." The effect of this announcement upon the assembled passengers was immediate and profound, each reaction revealing depths of character that their previous careful composure had concealed, while Marcus Whitfield's face transformed from resigned despair to incredulous relief as he realized that his supposed victim had been someone entirely different from the man whose financial dealings had created his desperate circumstances. Lady Pemberton's hand flew instinctively to her emerald necklace. Yet this time her gestures seemed less nervous adjustment than protective clutching, as if the revelation had somehow placed her precious jewels in jeopardy, while her aristocratic composure cracked sufficiently to reveal genuine fear beneath the carefully maintained facade of social superiority. Dr. Helena Voss closed her medical journal with a sharp snap that echoed through the suddenly silent saloon, her scholarly detachment replaced by an alertness that suggested professional interest in developments that might affect her own carefully guarded secrets. Miss Dorothy Crane's reaction proved most intriguing to Poirot's observant eye, her youthful features cycling through emotions too rapidly for genuine spontaneity, as if she were mentally recalculating odds and possibilities that this revelation had fundamentally altered, while her trembling hands stilled with suspicious suddenness when she believed herself unobserved. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional composure held firm, yet the detective noted how the purser's eyes darted repeatedly toward the sealed stateroom where the impostor's body lay, as if this new information had created concerns about evidence that might now be interpreted in entirely different ways, while his nervous energy manifested in unnecessary adjustments to his uniform that suggested deep-seated anxiety about implications he had not previously considered. Poirot himself received this intelligence with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose instincts had been proven correct, his methodical mind immediately beginning the complex process of reinterpreting every piece of evidence in light of this fundamental shift in the victim's identity while his grey eyes swept the assembled passengers with renewed interest as he considered how this revelation might affect their various motives and alibis. The incomplete word "ma" that the dying man had attempted to write took on entirely new significance if the victim had been Edmund Hartley rather than Sir Reginald Blackwood, while the careful staging of the crime scene suggested someone with intimate knowledge of how such investigations typically proceeded, knowledge that might be possessed by someone familiar with criminal enterprises rather than respectable society. The detectives' examination of the stateroom had revealed inconsistencies that now made perfect sense if viewed through the lens of mistaken identity, particularly the presence of documents that seemed too readily accessible and the theatrical positioning of evidence that had struck him as suspiciously convenient for investigators seeking obvious solutions to complex problems. The pipe tobacco ash in the victim's ashtray gained new importance if Edmund Hartley had been meeting with someone before his death, while the dampness patterns on the porthole suggested manipulation by someone who understood the ship's security procedures well enough to create opportunities for clandestine meetings or evidence disposal. As the ferry's engine slowed in preparation for docking, Poirot found himself confronting a mystery that had been fundamentally transformed by this revelation, yet remained as complex as ever in terms of identifying which among the passengers had possessed both motive and opportunity to kill a man whose true identity had been concealed from them all. The obvious solution of Whitfield's guilt had crumbled entirely, leaving in its wake a web of relationships and hidden motives that would require all of his considerable powers to untangle. While somewhere among these carefully controlled reactions to unexpected news walked a murderer whose crime had been far more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized, and whose true motive remained as obscure as the fog that had finally lifted to reveal the lights of France, beckoning them toward whatever justice or escape awaited on the approaching shore. The revelation of Edmund Hartley's true identity as an art forger's associate, rather than the distinguished Sir Reginald Blackwood, sent tremors through Hercule Poirot's methodical mind, not of confusion, but of sudden clarity, as if a complex mathematical equation had finally revealed its elegant solution after hours of patient calculation. While the other passengers struggled to comprehend how their carefully constructed relationships with the supposed baronet might be reinterpreted in light of his criminal associations, the detective felt the familiar stirring of his little grey cells as they began the delicate process of re-examining every piece of evidence through this fundamentally altered lens. The ferry's steady approach toward Calais harbour provided an urgent deadline that lent intensity to his deliberations, yet Poirot welcomed this pressure as a craftsman welcomes the final moments before unveiling a masterpiece, knowing that all the scattered elements of truth were finally beginning to arrange themselves into their proper configuration. The detective's mind immediately returned to the crime scene with fresh understanding, particularly the incomplete word "ma" that the dying man had apparently struggled to write with his failing strength. Yet now this crucial clue demanded complete reinterpretation if the victim had been involved in art forgery rather than legitimate collecting. Poirot recalled with crystalline precision how the fountain pen's nib had been bent at an unnatural angle, suggesting not the gentle failure of dying fingers, but the violent interruption of someone desperate to prevent a specific revelation from reaching paper, while the distinctive blot that had obscured the final letters spoke not of weakness but of sudden, decisive action by someone who knew exactly what Hartley was attempting to communicate. The detective's extensive experience with criminal psychology suggested that this was no random name or plea for help, but rather a word directly connected to Hartley's illicit activities, something so dangerous to the murderer that its completion had to be prevented at all costs. The presence of pipe tobacco ash in Hartley's ashtray, which had troubled Poirot from his initial examination of the stateroom, now took on profound significance when considered alongside Geoffrey Hartwell's nervous behavior and intimate knowledge of the ship's security procedures throughout the evening's investigation. The detective's trained observation had noted the purser's unconscious habit of adjusting the pipe that protruded from his uniform pocket, while his professional duties would have provided both legitimate access to passenger accommodations and the sort of regular contact with travelers that might facilitate smuggling operations requiring official credentials and reliable transportation between England and France. The moisture patterns on the stateroom's porthole, with salt crystals undisturbed at the lower rim, yet fresh dampness clinging above, suggested manipulation by someone familiar with a ship's fittings rather than the desperate fumbling of a panicked killer seeking escape routes. When Poirot considered the broader implications of an art forgery operation, the motive for murder became startlingly clear, particularly if Hartley had been involved in schemes that required sophisticated networks of authentication and transportation that a ship's officer might facilitate in exchange for substantial compensation. Yet such partnerships in criminal enterprise often ended in violence when trust deteriorated or when one participant threatened exposure to avoid personal consequences. The documents discovered in Hartley's attaché case, hastily retired after examination, might have contained evidence of such arrangements, while the theatrical positioning of the ornate letter opener beside the body suggested someone with experience in misdirecting investigations and creating false narratives that would satisfy cursory examination while concealing more complex criminal motives. The detective's re-examination of the other suspects revealed how each might be connected to Hartley's true profession, rather than his assumed identity, particularly Lady Pemberton's emerald necklace, which could represent either a target for forgery or genuine pieces requiring discreet transportation. While her financial difficulties might have made her vulnerable to involvement in schemes that promised substantial rewards for minimal risk. Dr. Helena Voss's medical journal, bearing traces of pink sealing wax that matched similar residue on Hartwell's keyring, suggested contact with sealed documents that might contain authentication certificates or scientific analyses crucial to successful forgery operations, while her clinical knowledge could serve purposes far beyond simple medical practice in the sophisticated world of art fraud. Miss Dorothy Crane's French stamp on correspondence, supposedly destined for New York, now seemed less like innocent mistake than deliberate misdirection, connecting her to Paris as a global center for both legitimate and illicit art trade. While her youthful appearance provided perfect camouflage for someone serving as courier or intermediary in operations that required movement of valuable items without arousing customs suspicion. The suspicious neatness of her writing materials, contrasted with her claims of emotional disturbance, suggested careful preparation rather than genuine disruption of innocent activities, while her reactions to questioning had revealed knowledge of circumstances she had clearly hoped to keep concealed. As the ferry's engines reduced speed for final approach to the French coast, Poirot felt the deep satisfaction of seeing complex psychological and physical evidence align themselves into a coherent pattern that explained not only the method and opportunity for murder, but the sophisticated criminal enterprise that had made such violence seem necessary when partnership had deteriorated beyond repair. The fog that had shrouded the vessel throughout the night had provided perfect cover for clandestine meetings and evidence manipulation, while the confined space of the ferry had created an ideal environment for confrontation between associates whose mutual trust had crumbled under the pressure of competing interests and dangerous secrets that could no longer be safely shared between them. The grand saloon of the Ferry Calypso had been transformed into something resembling a theater moments before the final curtain, its polished brass fittings and Persian carpets bearing witness to the most extraordinary performance of detection that any of the assembled passengers would ever witness. The lights of Calais harbor cast shifting patterns through the windows, no longer obscured by the fog that had provided such convenient cover for murder, while the steady vibration of the engines created an underlying rhythm that seemed to match the mounting tension in the elegant space. Hercule Poirot stood before his audience with the quiet authority of a master craftsman about to reveal his most intricate creation, his compact figure radiating the confidence that came from methodical application of logic to the complexities of human psychology. while his grey eyes surveyed each face with the satisfaction of one who had finally arranged all the scattered pieces of truth into their proper configuration. Captain Morrison had reluctantly agreed to delay the formal transfer of authority to French officials until the detective could present his complete analysis, though his weathered face showed the strain of a commanding officer who had discovered that his vessel had harbored secrets far more dangerous than a simple murder among passengers. The revelation that their victim was Edmund Hartley, an associate of art forgers, rather than the distinguished Sir Reginald Blackwood, had fundamentally altered every assumption about motive and method. Yet Poirot welcomed this complexity as a craftsman welcomes the finest materials for his most challenging work. Marcus Whitfield, recently released from his brief arrest, sat with the exhausted relief of a man reprieved from execution, while the other passengers arranged themselves with the careful attention to position that characterizes those who understand they remain under scrutiny despite the apparent shift in circumstances. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his accented English carrying the weight of absolute certainty earned through decades of unraveling human deception. We have been presented with a crime that appeared to be the desperate act of financial ruin, yet concealed beneath this convenient facade lies something far more sophisticated and dangerous. The revelation of our victim's true identity as Edmund Hartley, connected not to legitimate art collection but to the shadowy world of forgery and fraud, requires us to re-examine every piece of evidence with fresh understanding, for what seemed obvious in the light of one identity becomes meaningless in the context of another. The detective's methodical mind had already begun the complex process of reinterpreting physical evidence, witness statements, and psychological observations through this fundamentally altered lens, while his keen observation noted how each suspect reacted to this systematic dismantling of their carefully constructed assumptions. The incomplete word "ma" that the dying man had struggled to write before his fountain pen was violently struck from his failing fingers, demanded complete reinterpretation now that they understood Hartley's criminal associations, and Poirot's analysis of the pen's bent nib revealed not the gentle failure of weakening grip, but the forceful interruption of someone desperate to prevent a specific revelation from reaching paper. The victim was not attempting to identify Marcus Whitfield as his attacker, the detective explained, observing how relief flickered across the impresario's features, but rather was desperately trying to communicate something connected to his illicit activities, perhaps maritime or market, or some other word that would have exposed the sophisticated operation that required his death to protect. The distinctive blot that had obscured the final letters spoke not of natural weakness, but of calculated violence by someone who understood exactly what Hartley was attempting to reveal and could not permit such dangerous knowledge to survive its author. Poirot's systematic examination of the physical evidence revealed layers of deception that had been carefully constructed to misdirect investigation toward convenient conclusions, while concealing more complex criminal motives, beginning with the presence of pipe tobacco ash in Hartley's stateroom that had troubled his orderly mind from the initial survey of the crime scene. Two distinct types of ash were present in the crystal ash tray, he continued, producing the evidence with characteristic precision, the small cigars preferred by our victim and pipe tobacco of a darker cut that spoke to the presence of a second person during the crucial period before the murder occurred. His grey eyes swept the assembled suspects with methodical attention, noting how Geoffrey Hartwell's hand moved unconsciously toward the pipe that protruded from his uniform pocket before the purser caught himself and effected casual adjustment of his jacket instead. The detective's analysis of the stateroom's porthole revealed manipulation by someone with intimate knowledge of the ship's fittings rather than the desperate fumbling of a panicked killer seeking escape routes, the moisture patterns showing dampness on upper surfaces, while salt crystals remained undisturbed below, indicating recent opening by someone familiar with the mechanism's peculiarities. This detail eliminates many possibilities, Poirot observed, and points towards someone whose official duties would provide both legitimate access to passenger accommodations and the technical knowledge required to manipulate such fittings without leaving obvious traces of inexperience or desperation. Captain Morrison's expression grew increasingly troubled as the implications of this analysis became clear, suggesting that the murderer possessed authority and access that went far beyond ordinary passenger privileges. The pale green silk thread discovered near Hartley's desk had initially seemed to implicate Lady Pemberton, whose damaged evening shawl provided obvious connection to this physical evidence. Yet Poirot's re-examination suggested more sophisticated possibilities when considered alongside the victim's true profession and criminal associations. The thread might indicate presence, certainly, he explained, noting how the aristocrat's fingers ceased their nervous adjustment of her emerald necklace as suspicion shifted elsewhere. Yet it might equally represent deliberate misdirection by someone seeking to implicate an innocent party, or perhaps evidence of contact between the victim and someone who had recently been in Lady Pemberton's company, creating false connections designed to confuse rather than illuminate the truth. The detective's psychological analysis revealed how each suspect's nervous reactions throughout the evening had stemmed from their own hidden secrets rather than complicity in murder. Their eagerness to accept obvious solutions providing convenient distraction from more complex criminal enterprises. Dr. Helena Voss's medical expertise and scholarly demeanor had provided natural armor against psychological pressure, yet traces of pink sealing wax on her supposedly unread journal pages suggested contact with official documents that contradicted her claims of distant acquaintance with the victim, while her clinical knowledge of cardiac conditions and pharmaceutical effects created opportunities that a less methodical investigator might have overlooked. Miss Dorothy Crane's youthful vulnerability continued to provide effective camouflage for connections to Paris that she had clearly hoped to keep concealed. Her French correspondence revealing networks of association that extended far beyond innocent tourism, while her careful preparation of writing materials suggested planning rather than the genuine disruption of innocent activities that her tearful distress was designed to represent. As Poirot's exposition reached its crescendo, the detective's systematic elimination of false leads and misdirection began to focus with laser intensity upon the one individual whose position provided both means and opportunity, while his reactions throughout the evening had betrayed knowledge that went far beyond official duties or casual observation. Geoffrey Hartwell's professional competence in legitimate maritime activities had provided perfect camouflage for criminal enterprises requiring sophisticated networks of transportation and authentication, while his nervous energy and intimate knowledge of customs procedures created possibilities that other suspects simply could not have exploited with the efficiency that the crime demanded. The fog that had shrouded the vessel throughout the night had provided ideal cover for clandestine meetings and evidence manipulation, while the confined space of the ferry had created perfect conditions for confrontation between criminal associates whose mutual trust had deteriorated beyond repair. The ferry's engines had begun their final approach to the French coast, yet none of the passengers moved toward the exits as they absorbed the implications of Poirot's methodical reconstruction, their relief at escaping individual suspicion tempered by recognition of how skillfully they had been manipulated throughout the evening by someone whose official position had provided perfect authority for directing attention away from his own criminal activities. Captain Morrison's face showed the particular anguish of a commanding officer confronting betrayal among his most trusted subordinates, while the approaching French authorities would find their investigation fundamentally altered by revelations that transformed a simple murder into exposure of criminal enterprises that had operated with official protection and assistance. "The murderer walks among us still," Poirot concluded, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of one whose methodical analysis had penetrated every layer of deception and misdirection, protected by authority that should serve justice rather than criminal enterprise, yet betrayed by habits and knowledge that cannot be concealed from eyes trained to perceive truth beneath carefully constructed facades. The detective's grey eyes settled with unmistakable significance upon the one individual whose reactions had consistently betrayed guilt despite professional training in maintaining composure under pressure, while the assembled suspects felt the weight of approaching revelation that would finally expose the sophisticated criminal mind that had believed itself safe from detection within the respectable world of maritime authority and official responsibility. The moment of absolute revelation arrived with the inexorable certainty of dawn breaking through the last remnants of fog, and Hercule Poirot's grey eyes settled upon Geoffrey Hartwell with the quiet satisfaction of a master craftsman completing his most intricate work. The elegant saloon held its collective breath, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of the ferry's engines as they approached the lights of Calais harbour, while the assembled passengers felt the electric tension that precedes the final, devastating stroke of justice. The purser, who had maintained his professional composure throughout the evening's investigation with such admirable skill, now found his practiced demeanour beginning to crack under the weight of methodical analysis that had stripped away every layer of misdirection and false evidence. "Monsieur Hartwell," Poirot began, his accented English carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "your position as ship's purser provided not merely access to passenger accommodations and knowledge of security procedures, but the perfect cover for criminal enterprises that required official credentials and reliable transportation between England and France. You have played your part with admirable skill, maintaining the facade of the efficient and concerned officer, yet like all meticulously crafted illusions, yours contains the fatal flaw that betrays the larger truth." The detective's methodical mind had already arranged every piece of evidence into its proper configuration, and now he began the systematic dismantling of the sophisticated deception that had nearly succeeded in its deadly purpose. The physical evidence spoke with unmistakable clarity to those trained to interpret its silent testimony, beginning with the presence of two distinct types of ash in Edmund Hartley's crystal ashtray. The fine residue of the victim's preferred small cigars mingled with the coarser, darker ash of pipe tobacco that pointed directly toward the purser's habitual smoking preference. "You met with Hartley in his stateroom before the hour of his death," Poirot continued, observing how Hartwell's hand moved unconsciously toward the pipe that was conspicuously absent from its usual place in his uniform pocket. Not as purser and passenger, but as criminal partners whose profitable association had deteriorated beyond repair when mutual trust gave way to mutual suspicion and the threat of betrayal. The detective's examination of the stateroom's porthole revealed manipulation by someone with intimate knowledge of the ship's fittings rather than the desperate fumbling of a panicked killer, the moisture patterns showing dampness on upper surfaces, while salt crystals remained undisturbed below, indicating recent opening by someone familiar with the mechanism's peculiarities. Your confirmation to Captain Morrison that all portholes were secured early in the voyage created the perfect alibi, Poirot explained. Yet your own actions in opening this particular porthole after the murder to dispose of documents that would have exposed your criminal partnership left traces that only methodical observation could detect. The distinctive pattern of evaporation proved recent, skilled manipulation by someone who understood exactly how to avoid the scraping that would have disturbed the salt crust below. Most damning of all was the incomplete word that had nearly succeeded in its purpose of misdirecting suspicion toward Marcus Whitfield, yet revealed its true significance when examined through the lens of Hartley's actual profession and criminal associations. The dying man was not attempting to identify his attacker as Marcus, the detective revealed, noting how relief flickered across the impresario's exhausted features, but rather was desperately trying to write maritime, the key to his ledger of illicit shipments and the sophisticated operation that your official position made possible. When you realized what he was attempting to record, you struck the fountain pen from his failing fingers, creating the distinctive blot that obscured the final letters and nearly succeeded in creating the perfect scapegoat. The pink sealing wax that had been discovered throughout the investigation told its own story of official documents and authentication certificates that required the credibility of maritime authority to pass customs inspection without arousing suspicion, while traces of the same distinctive wax on Hartwell's master key provided physical evidence of contact with the sealed correspondence that had bound Hartley's criminal enterprise together. The art forgery operation required sophisticated networks of authentication and transportation that only someone with your official credentials could provide, Poirot explained, his systematic analysis revealing the full scope of criminal activities that had operated under the protection of maritime authority. Yet when Hartley's growing paranoia led him to document your partnership as insurance against betrayal, the profitable association that had served both parties so well suddenly became a mortal threat that could only be resolved through violence. Captain Morrison's weathered face reflected the particular anguish of a commanding officer confronting betrayal among his most trusted subordinates, his faith in maritime discipline and professional integrity shattered by revelations that transformed his vessel from a respectable passenger ferry into an unwitting accomplice to international criminal enterprise. The other passengers watched with fascination and horror as Poirot's methodical exposition revealed how they had been manipulated throughout the evening, their various secrets and hidden motives providing convenient distraction from the real criminal who had orchestrated their suspicions with the skill of a master puppeteer. "Your greatest mistake, Monsieur Hartwell," Poirot observed with the clinical precision that characterized his most devastating revelations, "was believing that your official position would provide immunity from suspicion, yet authority creates its own vulnerabilities when subjected to methodical analysis by minds trained to perceive deception beneath respectable facades. The very knowledge and access that made your criminal activities possible also created the distinctive patterns of evidence that betrayed your guilt to careful observation. As the weight of irrefutable evidence mounted with inexorable force, Hartwell's professional composure finally shattered completely, his carefully maintained mask dissolving to reveal the desperate face of a cornered criminal whose sophisticated schemes had been methodically unraveled by superior intellect. "He was going to expose everything," the purser cried, his voice hoarse with desperation and rage. "Hartley had become greedy, reckless, threatening to bring down the entire operation if I didn't meet his demands. I built this network, cultivated the buyers, provided the secure passage between countries. He was just a go-between, yet he wanted to destroy everything we had created together." The confession that followed confirmed every detail of Poirot's methodical reconstruction, revealing the sophisticated criminal mind that had believed itself perfectly concealed within the respectable world of maritime authority, yet had been betrayed by the very expertise that had made such elaborate deception possible. Captain Morrison's immediate action in restraining his subordinate reflected both professional duty and personal betrayal, while the assembled passengers felt the peculiar relief of those who had survived an ordeal that had tested their own hidden secrets without exposing them to the consequences they had feared throughout the long night. As the French authorities came aboard with quiet efficiency to take the murderer into custody, Hercule Poirot observed the final collapse of Hartwell's criminal facade with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose methodical work had achieved its intended purpose. The fog had lifted completely, revealing the lights of Calais beckoning toward whatever justice awaited on the approaching shore, while the psychological atmosphere within the ferry remained charged with the electricity of revelation that had exposed human nature in all its complexity and capacity for both deception and ultimate accountability. "It is curious, mesdames et messieurs," the little Belgian detective reflected as he prepared to disembark, smoothing his mustache with characteristic precision, "how those who live by schedules and official seals come to believe that human conscience can be routed and stamped like cargo manifest. Yet murder, it has always a way of arriving early at its destination, non. The sea may forgive many follies, but never the disorder of a soul that seeks to hide its crimes beneath the tide of respectability. With that philosophical observation, Hercule Poirot took his leave, his little grey cells having once again triumphed over the most sophisticated criminal deception, proving that no amount of official authority could ultimately conceal the truth from methodical analysis and unwavering dedication to justice. The French authorities boarded the ferry with quiet efficiency as the lights of Calais harbour cast their welcoming glow across the now peaceful waters, their crisp uniforms and methodical procedures providing stark contrast to the elegant chaos that had characterized the night's extraordinary investigation. Geoffrey Hartwell, his professional composure finally shattered beyond repair, offered no resistance as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, his confession having stripped away the carefully maintained facade that had concealed sophisticated criminal enterprise beneath the respectable veneer of maritime authority. Captain Morrison supervised the formal transfer with the heavy dignity of a commanding officer whose faith in his subordinates had been profoundly betrayed, yet who understood that justice must be served regardless of personal humiliation or professional embarrassment that would inevitably follow such revelations. The assembled passengers remained in their seats with the stunned silence of those who had witnessed truth emerge from deception through methodical application of superior intellect, their own hidden secrets seeming suddenly insignificant compared to the murderous conspiracy that had operated among them with such deadly efficiency throughout the fog-shrouded crossing. Lady Pemberton's aristocratic composure had returned in full measure, her fingers no longer betraying nervous anxiety as they adjusted her emerald necklace. Yet she approached Hercule Poirot with genuine gratitude tempered by recognition of how closely she had approached genuine danger through her own financial difficulties and desperate circumstances. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice carrying the weight of sincere appreciation, "your methodical analysis has saved not only an innocent man from wrongful accusation, but has revealed how easily respectability can conceal the most sophisticated criminal minds." Marcus Whitfield sat with the exhausted relief of a man reprieved from execution, his theatrical instincts finally allowing him to express genuine emotion after hours of forced composure, under suspicion that had nearly cost him his freedom and reputation. The incomplete word that had seemed to point so directly toward his guilt now revealed itself as Edmund Hartley's desperate attempt to expose the maritime network that had made his murder necessary. Yet the impresario's financial entanglements with the supposed Sir Reginald Blackwood remained genuine complications that would require resolution through legal channels rather than criminal investigation. His approach to the detective carried the humility of one who had learned harsh lessons about the consequences of desperate financial arrangements with individuals whose true nature remained carefully concealed. Dr. Helena Voss maintained her scholarly demeanor with clinical precision, yet her conversation with Poirot revealed connections to the art forgery network that went beyond simple coincidence, her medical expertise having been solicited for authentication purposes that she had wisely declined to provide. Miss Dorothy Crane's youthful vulnerability had provided effective camouflage throughout the evening's investigation, yet her tearful confession to the detective revealed networks of association extending to Paris that suggested her role as unwitting courier in operations requiring the sort of innocent appearance that her youth and apparent naivety provided perfectly. Captain Morrison approached the little Belgian detective with the particular gratitude of a man whose professional reputation had been preserved through intervention of superior intellect and unwavering dedication to truth. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his weathered voice carrying genuine appreciation, "your investigation has exposed criminal activities that might have continued indefinitely under the protection of official authority, yet I cannot help but feel responsible for failing to detect such sophisticated deception among my own officers." The captain's recognition of how closely his vessel had come to being permanently associated with miscarriage of justice reflected his understanding that maritime reputation, once tainted by criminal association, could never be fully restored regardless of subsequent revelations. The detective accepted this recognition with characteristic modesty, his methodical mind already beginning to file away the various elements of the case for future reference. Yet he remained troubled by the broader implications of criminal networks that operated with such sophisticated protection and official credentials. "Captain Morrison," he replied, smoothing his mustache with unconscious precision, "your Monsieur Hartwell possessed the intelligence and position to create enterprises that might have operated indefinitely without detection, had not human psychology provided the fatal flaw that betrayed his careful planning. The murderer's greatest mistake was believing that official authority would provide immunity from methodical analysis. As the passengers began gathering their belongings for disembarkation, each carrying secrets that had been tested but not fully exposed during the night's investigation, Poirot reflected upon the complex psychology that had driven the evening's events from apparent simplicity to sophisticated criminal revelation. The fog that had provided such convenient cover for murder and deception had finally lifted completely, revealing the French coast in all its clarity, yet the detective understood that human nature remained as obscure as ever in its capacity for both criminal sophistication and ultimate self-betrayal through the very expertise that made elaborate deception possible. The art forgery operation that had provided motive for Edmund Hartley's murder represented criminal enterprise requiring networks of authentication, transportation, and official protection extending far beyond the capabilities of individual criminals operating in isolation, while Hartwell's position as ship's purser had provided perfect cover for activities requiring regular movement between England and France, with access to customs procedures and official documentation that ordinary criminals could never have exploited with such apparent legitimacy. The little Belgian detective gathered his modest belongings with characteristic precision, his grey eyes taking a final survey of the grand saloon where truth had emerged through methodical application of logic to the complexities of human psychology and criminal enterprise. The Persian carpets and polished brass fittings bore silent witness to the most extraordinary performance of detection that any passenger vessel had ever hosted, while the approaching dawn represented the beginning of justice for crimes that had operated under official protection until exposed by superior intellect and relentless pursuit of truth. "It is curious, mes amis," Poirot observed to no one in particular as he prepared to disembark, his accented English carrying the philosophical weight that characterized his most profound reflections. "How those who live by schedules and official seals come to believe that human conscience can be stamped and routed like cargo manifest. Yet murder, it has always the inconvenient habit of revealing itself to methodical analysis, regardless of how carefully it may be concealed beneath the respectability of official authority." With that characteristic observation, Hercule Poirot stepped toward the gangway, his little grey cells having once again triumphed over sophisticated criminal deception, proving that no amount of careful planning could ultimately conceal truth from unwavering dedication to justice and the methodical application of superior intellect to the eternal mysteries of human nature. The morning sun cast golden rays across the harbor of Calais as Hercule Poirot descended the gangway of the Ferry Calypso with characteristic precision, his patent leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the wooden planks, while the crisp air carried the salt scent of a new day that had finally burned away the fog of deception and murder. Behind him, the elegant vessel that had served as both crime scene and theater for his methodical investigation stood transformed from a simple passenger ferry into a monument to the eternal struggle between justice and those who would corrupt official authority for criminal gain. The French authorities had completed their work with quiet efficiency, Geoffrey Hartwell now in custody, with his confession providing a complete map of the art forgery network that had operated under the protection of maritime credentials and respectable appearances. Captain Morrison approached the detective with the heavy dignity of a commanding officer whose faith in his subordinates had been profoundly shaken, yet who understood that justice demanded accountability regardless of personal embarrassment. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his weathered voice carrying genuine gratitude, "your investigation has exposed criminal activities that might have continued indefinitely under official protection. I cannot adequately express my appreciation for preventing a miscarriage of justice that would have destroyed an innocent man while allowing the true criminal to escape." The detective accepted this recognition with characteristic modesty, his methodical mind already filing away the various elements of the case while considering the broader implications of networks requiring such sophisticated coordination between criminal enterprise and legitimate authority. As Poirot made his way through the bustling port, his gray eyes took final inventory of the other passengers whose lives had been forever altered by their encounter with murder on the midnight crossing. Lady Pemberton departed with renewed aristocratic composure, her emerald necklace catching the morning light as she entered a waiting carriage. Yet her conversation with the detective had revealed genuine gratitude for his intervention. In circumstances that had brought her dangerously close to disaster, through financial desperation and association with individuals whose true nature remained carefully concealed. Marcus Whitfield walked with the unsteady relief of a man reprieved from execution, his theatrical instincts finally allowing him to express genuine emotion after hours of suspicion that had nearly cost him his freedom, while his future remained complicated by legitimate financial difficulties that would require resolution through proper legal channels rather than desperate arrangements with mysterious benefactors. Dr. Helena Voss maintained her scholarly demeanor with clinical precision as she gathered her medical journals and prepared for academic pursuits in France. Yet her admission to Poirot had revealed connections to the art authentication world that suggested her expertise might be solicited again by those seeking scientific credibility for purposes both legitimate and questionable. Miss Dorothy Crane's youthful vulnerability continued to provide effective camouflage as she boarded the Paris Express, her tearful confession having revealed networks of association extending far beyond innocent tourism, while her role as unwitting courier in sophisticated operations would require careful monitoring by authorities seeking to dismantle the remaining elements of Hartwell's criminal enterprise. The little Belgian detective found himself reflecting upon the complex psychology that had driven the evening's events from apparent simplicity through layers of misdirection to the ultimate revelation of murder, committed to protect criminal operations that had exploited the very institutions designed to serve justice. Hartwell's position as ship's purser had provided perfect cover for activities requiring regular movement between England and France, with access to documentation and customs procedures that ordinary criminals could never exploit with such apparent legitimacy, while his professional competence in legitimate duties had created the ideal facade for illicit enterprises that might have continued indefinitely without detection. "It is curious," Poirot murmured to himself as he settled into his railway compartment and began arranging his belongings with characteristic precision, how those who live by schedules and official seals come to believe that human conscience can be stamped and routed like cargo manifest. Yet murder, it has always the inconvenient habit of revealing itself to methodical analysis, regardless of how carefully it may be concealed beneath the respectability of official authority. The detective's analysis of the case had revealed how criminal enterprise could exploit the very institutions designed to protect society, requiring constant vigilance from those charged with maintaining justice against such sophisticated corruption. The fog-shrouded crossing had provided ideal conditions for murder and deception, yet it had also created the confined environment necessary for methodical investigation that could penetrate every layer of false evidence to expose the truth beneath. The elegant saloon of the Ferry had been transformed into a theater where human nature revealed itself in all its complexity, from the desperate measures that financial ruin could inspire to the sophisticated criminal mind that believed itself perfectly concealed within respectable authority, yet was ultimately betrayed by the very expertise that made elaborate deception possible. As the express train began its journey toward Paris, and whatever new mysteries might await his attention, Poirot felt the profound satisfaction that accompanied the successful application of logic to the eternal puzzles of human motivation and criminal psychology. His little gray cells had once again triumphed over elaborate deception through patient analysis of evidence, both physical and psychological, proving that no amount of official credentials or careful planning could ultimately conceal murder from unwavering dedication to truth and methodical investigation of the complexities that drive ordinary people to extraordinary crimes in their desperate attempts to escape the consequences of their own moral failures and criminal ambitions.